Hello, this is Brian Rowe with Mythic MTG Tech number 154 here, going over the basics of aggro red decks. This is part of my 101 strategy series. I'm going to be going over several different archetypes, and I hope to make it into more modern archetypes also that kind of combine these. It's essential to get down these basic archetypes, though, before we jump into the really complex stuff, so that you understand what you're up against, what the kind of major game plans are, and how to combat those. This one is close to my heart. When I sold out of Magic to go to law school, I kept one red deck. It was a Red Deck Wins red deck. It had Ashen Riders, it had Stone Rains, it had Curse Scrolls, Lightning Bolts, Rishadan Ports, Wastelands, and a bunch of Arabian Nights Mountains. It was a fun deck to play. I liked it because I could take it into a store at any time, get a pickup game, and have a relatively good chance of crushing people. Red Deck Wins has been around a long time. There's several different versions of it. This is the version that I am most familiar with. I played very similar versions of this competitively for about a year and a half overall. The one thing I really like about this deck is the way that it gives individuals threats. It puts you in the driver's seat and it makes your opponent play defense. It's the same type of feeling that I really like about tempo decks, which we'll cover at another point in time. This quote from David Price is one of the most telling strategic quotes out there. People like control because they think it shows that they're good Magic players. Active decks, on the other hand, produce threats, and control decks must have the right answer to the right threat. If not, they're in trouble. While there are wrong answers, there are no wrong threats. This is really at the core of playing an aggro deck, understanding where you are in the archetype, and occasionally you may even be playing defense against a faster deck, but looking for the opportunities to make threats and to keep your opponent off guard is extremely important. The center of these decks is often the burn spells, Lightning Bolt being a classic that goes all the way back to Alpha and Beta. The ability to use this as burn to the face or creature removal or even swinging combat is extremely important. You're going to hear lots of different terms when people talk about aggro red decks, and they use them kind of interchangeably. They do technically have different definitions. I'm not going to jump into it too far. Burn decks tend to focus on those spells that can be sent directly to the face. They're often very, very light on creatures. These decks are often a little bit one-dimensional. They don't have the depth to go for the long game, and they almost play more like combo decks. Red Deck Wins, on the other hand, has a much higher creature count and has kind of a backup of those burn spells for the last few points of damage. Sligh is kind of in the middle. It has those creature aspects to it and the burn spells. In all of these cases, your mana curve is going to be a little bit different. The number of lands you use and the type of lands is also going to be different. One important thing to remember is that creatures have been getting better over time. If you look at the very early aggro decks, they were playing things like Ironclaw Orcs, which is 1 red, 1 colorless for a 2/2 that has a disadvantage to it. Ash Zealot and Lightning Mauler are just incredible cards compared to this. You can get a much more aggressive, powerful deck with Modern Magic cards than you will see out of decks that play 4th edition or before. This style of deck has been around a very, very long time. This is a very early version of Red Deck Wins. It's running for Strip Mine, so it's got some land destruction, disruption components in it. It's got Mishra's Factories as a way to do extra damage if somebody tries to wipe the board, and it has a nice selection of cards like Lightning Bolt, Black Vice, Incinerate, heavy damage spells in there. In Modern, I put together a video earlier this year on Bob Bolt, and one of the things I had in there was a Modern budget deck that was very heavy on the burn side. This is a very different strategy than what you see with more of the Red Deck Win strategies. This has more burn that is going directly to the face. It's got a little bit of depth with Isochronic Scepter or Pyromancer's Ascension, and it's nice because it does blank your opponent's removal spells because they have no targets to go after. So you get a few extra cards that are dead in your opponent's deck at your game 1. Now, if you compare this to a more traditional Red Deck Wins, there's a very different balance in creatures, lands, and spells. Your land count often needs to be a little bit higher if you're running things like Wastelands or Ports. Your creatures are also much higher in kind of a red deck wins deck because your creatures end up doing a lot of damage. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Many creatures can actually produce much more damage than a lightning bolt. And that's why these decks really have creatures in them, because they are really effective burn. Goblin Guide and Eidolon of the Great Revel are two of the absolute best. I'm not a fan of Vexing Devil. It's never worked for me. The Punisher mechanic always seems to backfire. But Grim Lavamancer, that's one that I really enjoy, especially if you are in a creature-heavy environment. You can often use this guy to clear the path for your Goblin Guide again and again. Two cards that I think are massively underplayed in Modern right now are Molten Rain and Searing Blaze. The ability to destroy an opponent's land often sets them back a turn, and there's so many dual lands in Modern that you are often getting 2 points of damage out of this. Searing Blaze can also be a blowout in the mirror match. This is one of my favorite things. The ability to kill my opponent's creature when they're attacking, especially when I use a fetch land to activate the landfall on their turn, is just incredible. I really, really like this card. I don't understand why it doesn't make it into more main decks, and it should be in almost all sideboards in this aggressive type of deck. Another really important concept to think about when playing a deck like this is your life usually doesn't matter as much as your opponent's. Deck thinning, though, can get you an extra card or two that give you the last piece of burn to finish somebody off. So being able to pull cards out of your deck may seem like you're only getting a 1 or 2% chance each turn. That's true, but over 5 or 10 turns and over 5 or 10 games, that adds up to a 20 or 30% chance to get an extra game. We can go into the math in a different video. I definitely looked at it very closely. This is something, though, that I strongly recommend, which is playing fetch lands in your aggro decks, especially if the curve is really low, because the quality of your card draw is going to be better towards the end. These decks are also very powerful in Standard. They're always very powerful in Standard, especially the week after there's a release. People don't know how to play defense. It's difficult. You can often put together a deck to play offense and crush people early on. This is a solid Sligh deck that has a very different feel to it because it's putting enchantments on creatures. You put enough huge threats out there, they're not giant threats, but they do enough damage that it adds up. You wait for your opponent to remove some of them and then put the enchantments on the remaining ones to get through the last few points of damage. This is another solid deck that a few weeks ago took 10th place at a Star City Games. It splashes a little bit of white, but it's heavy, heavy red. It hits 11 creatures and a lot of burn spells. This is the type of deck that you always want to test against in your current Standard environment. You want to make sure that whatever you're playing can beat a deck like this. If not, you should seriously look at playing a deck like this or redesigning the deck that you're currently playing. One more last example from Standard. This is a more traditional aggro deck that's heavier on creatures. Look at the curve on this deck. You're looking at a lot of 1 and 2 casters and a lower mana count. Very, very low mana count, including 8 fetch lands, so you can pull your land out. You're only playing 11 mana producing lands in the whole deck. Every single draw is going to be really good when you get into turn 4, turn 5, turn 6. I want to take a second to talk about the Monastery Swiftspear. Amazing aggro card. It is being played in Legacy, in Modern, and in Standard right now. It is the equivalent of Goblin Guide. These are the 2 best aggro creatures in Legacy, Modern, and the Swiftspears even in Standard. If you're building a deck, look for ways to put these guys in, learn how to play with them. You can get a huge amount of damage out of creatures like this. Finally, let's talk about sideboarding. If you're going to be the aggro player, I really like cards like Smash to Smithereens. Although Shatterstorm and Vandal Blast can be blowouts, the Smash to Smithereens has 3 damage on it. Think about what your goal is, and if your goal is to remove your opponent from the game with damage, use sideboard cards that feed into that goal for this style of deck. A lot of people suggest in a heavy red environment playing something like Dragonclaw on the sideboard. I do not suggest it. It is a bad card. Look at cards like Forkbolt or Grim Lavamancer that give you control and board presence so that your creatures get through. Whatever environment you're playing in, if blue is there, red is one of the best ways to stop blue. Red Elemental Blast and Pyroblast have been around a long time. A lot of people don't realize, though, that Boil is in Modern. You can crush blue decks with the sideboard cards that red has. If the current environment is very hostile to red, look for main deck and sideboard cards that have red effects that aren't actually red. This helps you get rid of things like core Firewalkers or push through damage if someone's playing Circle of Protections. Another important part to remember for your sideboard is that you have access to all the wonderful artifacts out there. Use them. If dredge or graveyard removal is needed, you have so many options. If your opponents are playing artifacts, things like Null Rod are just incredible. If they're playing giant creatures and you've got a burn deck, Ensnaring Bridge is one of the best ways to deal with those creature decks. Thanks, this has been Brian Rowe with Mythic MTG Tech doing a basic strategy on Red Aggro decks. We've got some cool patron pack openings coming up probably this weekend. We're also going to be doing an Ask Anything tomorrow, so I'm going to be posting that and giving people a few days to ask questions on it, and then I'll be answering them the week after. Thank you everybody who's over there on Patreon supporting the channel. I greatly appreciate it.